Hey y'all, it's Ashley at Bookishrealm. Welcome back to another video, or welcome if you are new here. So I was sitting around the other day thinking, as I sometimes do when my brain is not clogged with everything else, or I just don't feel like turning it off. And I realized, like, I get asked a lot of questions in this community, but a question that I've never been asked is, what elements make a book bad? So, like, for me, what makes a bad book? And I started thinking about that. I'm like, yeah, you know, I review pretty extensively. I try to keep up with my reviews as best as I can. I often come here and have conversations about books, but I've never talked about what elements make a book a bad reading experience for me. So I thought that today I would talk a little bit about some things that do not work well for me in books. Now, I didn't want this list to be too long, but when I started writing the list, I was like, yo, there's a lot of stuff that I apparently do not care for in books, or elements that will definitely drop a book down for me in terms of star rating and how I receive the book. Now, before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and let you know, this is beyond the typical. You understand what I'm saying? Like, the obvious. Racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, like those obvious things that would just automatically drop a book down for me. I'm not talking about those things. I think that those things are often apparent. Maybe sometimes they're not. I should be careful with my words here. But those are, I think for me, are obvious elements that will bring a book down in terms of star rating. I am talking about things that are very subjective here, in terms of the fact that this will definitely vary by individuals, because we can all be reading the same book, but how we perceive some of these things, they may be elements that make a book great for a group of people, and for me it doesn't work. And there's going to be one book that I'm going to bring up specifically. Well, there's two, because one of them, by the time that this video goes up, I should have already talked about one of these books, and then the other one I've talked about extensively in the past. So let's go ahead and jump in, because I don't want this video to be too long, and it is a 9-bullet list. Clearly I have some feelings that I haven't tapped into, that I needed to tap into. So let's go ahead. All right, so the first thing, lack of plot development and or character development. If there is no plot development or character development, I can't get with it. Now, that's not to say that I can't read a book that's primarily plot, it's plot driven, or a book that is primarily character driven. I have a little bit more of a hard time with character driven books, because in my mind I don't feel like anything is happening, but that can be the intention of the writer. However, if you don't have any of that, there is no plot development, there is no character development, and you want me to walk into your book with vibes, baby, it ain't finna happen. And the one book that everybody's like, just going for the vibes, Fourth Wing, okay? Fourth Wing is a prime example of a book that did not do it for me plot development wise, character development wise. The book made absolutely no sense. None of that book made any sense. And I am not a vibes person. I'm a vibes person when it comes to humans. I am an energy person, feeling the energy of other people, feeling the energy of a room. But I am not going to go in a book and turn my brain off and just be like, I'm just cooling for the vibes. Now, a book can have good energy and good vibes, but it has to have more than that in order for it to be a read that I am excited about, that I want to brag about, that I want to share with other readers. Me going in with vibes and you have nothing else to offer me is absolutely a no. The next section that I have is poor writing. And there are a couple of elements that went into poor writing, because I felt like when I was thinking about it and I said poor writing, I was like, man, poor writing is a very generalized way of talking. Poor writing could be anything. So here are a couple of things that I think fall under the umbrella of poor writing. Lack of editing. I have read some books that are traditionally published and I am very confused on where the editing was. Who was the editor and who sent this to press and said this is it and this is okay? Because why? Why is that a thing? I am more likely to be lenient on independent authors because they often do not have the same financial capacity to invest in an editor. Not to say that they don't have editors or they don't have people who read their books for them to check for edits, but I do think that in terms of accessibility, both finances and other resources, it's a little bit of a different, like a ball game. And so I'm a little bit more lenient with indie. However, coming from major publishing houses and your book doesn't feel like it's been edited or there's like blatant mistakes in it, I'm confusion, because why is that even a thing? That shouldn't even be a thing. For me, the flow of a book, and I'm not even sure how to necessarily describe when I say like flow of a book. It's just that, and it's not even about things being in sequential order. It's just that we are moving from topic to topic, part to part of a book in a seamless way. It doesn't feel choppy. I have read books that have and this is also going to sound weird, but this is the musician part of me. They have a very staccato nature to them. And it just feels choppy. It doesn't seamlessly flow from one part of the book into the next. And that's the best way I know how to describe that. Overly verbose, like reading a book where it was, 600 pages and you're like, why? Icebreaker. Here was another example. Icebreaker is almost 500 pages long. For why? Why is a contemporary romance? And that seems to be a trend now, with contemporary romances being 500, 600, 700, 800 pages. Why? For what? For why? Why? It doesn't need to be that long. You don't need to talk that much. It ain't enough happening for you to talk that much. Granted, fantasy, sci-fi, that's different because the complexity of world building, taking into account magic systems, taking into account, especially if this is like a futuristic version of the earth and kind of detailing all that information out, I am more likely to be like, oh yeah, well that adds up. But an 800-page contemporary romance, what the hell could you be writing about? What could this couple be going through that you need 800 damn pages to write about it? It's just too much. Another thing for me is telling and not showing. I have seen this happen a little bit more often for me as a reader than it has in the past. And a lot of that has been with authors shifting genres and age categories, which is, I don't know if that's me projecting or it just really heavily feels that when authors make the shift to genres, especially when they are contemporary lit fic individuals, romance individuals, and then they hop to writing something like fantasy, I find that there is a struggle with showing what's happening instead of telling me as a reader what's happening, which for me in some instances almost creates like this lack of trust, that you don't trust me to have the cognitive skills to make inferences about your work. And that to me is like a nail in a coffin. I don't like that. I think that even with Kidlit, I feel like sometimes authors get so caught up in worrying about whether a kid may or may not understand what they're doing that they will tell and not show anything. And it's almost like you have to trust even your youngest readers to be able to make those inferences about your work using those critical thinking skills. Like you want to challenge them, and sometimes I don't necessarily see that. And the last one for poor writing is rhyming schemes that don't work right. And that is specifically for picture books. I have been reading a lot of picture books this year, more than I probably even read in previous years, especially now, like documenting it. I can see a lot more of what I'm reading, but I have come across a couple of picture books that have tried to use certain rhyming schemes in their picture books, which makes them great or potentially great for read alouds for like a story time setting. And they be making words rhyme that don't really technically rhyme, and I'm like, who approved this? Because this really doesn't rhyme and it does not work. The cadence of having to read this aloud would not work in that setting. And a lot of people don't realize that every picture book that you see is not read aloud material. And somewhere along the lines that has gotten, I don't know how it's gotten kind of like lost in translation, where people think every picture book is a picture book you can use for story time, and that in fact is not true. Every picture book is not appropriate for a story time setting. And so I think that we have some creators who are trying to make their books great for a story time setting, and the rhyming schemes are absolute filth. So there's that. The third bullet that I have: when your plot is too obvious, and this is specific for mysteries and thrillers, I have started reading a lot more, I've had the urge to dive into more adult thrillers lately, and I've read a handful this year, and that is my Achilles heel. If you want to completely destroy me, give me a thriller where everything is apparent by the time I am 50, 60 pages in. I hate it. And I have given 2 adult thrillers 2 stars this year for that very same reason. Too predictable. I don't like the predictability of a thriller. I like a thriller that will lead me in one direction and then completely like spin me around, and I had no idea that anything was happening. And I try to go into thrillers and mysteries and not solving the issue, but it's hard for me to do that. And so if I'm able to connect your dots very easily, you're not gonna get a good review from me whatsoever. Next one is also very picture book specific, but also could be graphic novel specific. When the artwork is not appealing. Now this one is super subjective, and because an eye for artwork, it varies from person to person. What I think is great artwork, someone else could be like, absolutely not. It's not appealing to their eye. So this one is a hard one, but I must say it is something that I take into account clearly when I am reviewing manga, graphic novel, comics, picture books. They are a visual medium, and so because they're a visual medium, that is a criteria that I take into consideration whenever I am reviewing them. And I'm not just talking about the actual illustrations, I'm talking about line work, I'm talking about inking, I'm talking about coloring. And if those elements are not working together, then unfortunately typically the book does not work for me. And I can give it points for the storytelling aspect, but their purpose is to serve as a visual medium, and the art is what guides the story, so I have to take that more into account than the storytelling itself, if any of that makes sense. Endings that are too perfect. You know, I know people like to quote unquote read for an escape. Because people use that as a crutch for other things. If you read for escape because you genuinely just want a step away from this ugly world, I understand. But there are people who use that statement as a crutch to not read things outside of their own experiences. I have been coming across a lot more middle grade that is steering away from the perfect ending, which I do like. Every story does not need to be wrapped up with a neat little bow because it's not realistic. And I think that, especially in children's literature, I think I look at this more so in children's literature than I do adult. And I would even include like YA in that group of kidlit. They look to these books to be a reflection of their experiences or the experiences of others. That's what the intent is supposed to be. And if we are trying to make real world connections here, then everything is not going to be perfect. That doesn't mean that the trauma has to outweigh the joy, because I don't want anybody to hear that and then run with it and be like, oh, you just like trauma porn. No, what I'm saying is that there's a way to handle tough topics in a realistic way while still providing your characters with the joy and support that they need to make it through those tough topics. And I don't think that every solution has to be perfect in order for the book to have a major impact. I hope you followed me when I said that, because somebody's going to hear that and still think that I'm a trauma porn whore, because it's the internet. This next one is one that I should have already talked about, because the video where I talk about this book should have been included in a video that would have gone up a few days before this video. We'll see how this happens. It should have gone up. I'm not sure that I like graphic violence for the sake of violence. I recently read Outlander, and this was my first time reading the book in 10 years. I had read it in around 2014. I definitely was in a different place 10 years younger. So we're saying early 20s. I was just getting back into reading, and everyone was talking about this, and it would have been close to when, maybe 8 years instead of 10 then, because I feel like it was not too far removed from when the TV show came out, which I think was 2016, 2017, but it was not too long before that. And I had come across the book, and you see things differently in your early 20s as opposed to your early 30s. I think that as I've gotten older, as I have read more, my eye has become more critical to what I've been consuming. And Outlander is a very, very dark book. And younger me, I don't think realized how dark that book was. And I feel like what makes this book so difficult to review or talk about is that the history nerd in me loved all of the rich historical information that we got. I love that. That the history nerd in me is just like, oh my gosh, I'm eating this up. The other side of me, the very much so woman side of me, that has had her fair share of trauma like everyone else, was quite disturbed by some of the things that Claire experienced at the hands of men, including her own husband. And see, there's a way to discuss those things and it being a product of its time and how women were perceived by men during that time period. But you don't have to do it with Grape, you get where I'm going with that, being in so many scenes. That book is full of so much non-consensual sexual activity that I feel like Diana Gabaldon, however you say her last name, included it for the sake of including it. I cannot get down with that. That is a tough thing for me, and I'm still riding the fence on whether I'm going to continue that series or not. But any book where we have violence for the sake of violence because it is something that the author is working through, there is some unchecked or undiscovered underlying issues there, that's tough for me. Those scenes were tough for me to get through, and it is the prime example of why I ended up going back and rating Outlander lower than what I originally did, because it didn't feel like all of that was necessary. I don't feel like all of that sexual violence was necessary to move that story forward. It was grape for the sake of grape, and I don't like that at all. It's disturbing. So that's one of the few books where I've come across that recently. I can't do it. That was a lot. That was 880 something pages worth of that. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Actually, this is 8 bullets, y'all. Boy, I can't count. It's 8 because we only have 2 left. Another one, lack of content warnings for dark romances. I am not an avid dark romance reader, but I have read dark romances, and I appreciate when authors include content warnings because it is a good way to determine whether this is a book that you want to pick up or one that you want to bypass based off of the content. And there are people who argue for like, content warnings are spoilers. No, content warnings protect people from having to re-experience their own trauma, okay? I say that as someone who likes to know about certain things because I don't want to relive that experience through a book. I have already intrusive thoughts, PTSD type stuff, and I don't want that to resurface because I'm reading a book that does not have a content warning. I do not do incest at all. I don't, when it comes to adult romance, taboo romance, I don't do that, okay? There are creators out here who enjoy it. Listen, that's your business, not mine. But incest is where I draw the line with taboo romances. I read a book a few years ago where the author did not provide a content warning that would be prevalent in her book. And I did not find that out until 2-3 pages before the end of the book. So I was pissed because I wouldn't have picked it up had I known that was in it. I was pissed. I was disgusted. I wrote that in my review. The author decided that she wanted to clap back. And so I clapped back by screenshotting it, her comment, putting that on Twitter, and then screenshotting the pages where incest was on page and putting it on Twitter. I'm petty. And then the last one I think is very specific to YA. And I hope this makes sense, but when I explain it, I think it'll make sense. Writing up when you're attempting to target a certain audience. So YA right now is going through an identity crisis. It does not know what it's supposed to be. I can tell you what it was, what the intentions were. And by the time this video goes up, I should have also had another video where I am reading YA books through the decades. Fingers crossed that video goes up this week. I've been working on that video for like a year because I'm a mood reader and y'all know how that goes. Back in that time, because I think this first video was the 60s and 70s, YA books were definitely written with teens in mind. The first young adult book was written by a teen for teens, and we're talking The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. Now, in this decade, in this century, 21st century, and I won't even say that even the first half of the 20th century, the first half of the 2000s. Dang it, y'all. It's like 1 o'clock in the morning, mind you. I don't know if it was as bad. I won't know until I get closer to that time. But I can say now in the past 4 or 5 years, YA is written and aged up. It's written with college students and adults in mind. And I have a problem with that because your target audience is 12 to 18. And I'm not saying that you don't find 18-year-olds in college but typically what you're looking at is books catered to a high school audience. These books now are being targeted for people who are not in high school, who like the accessibility, the reading level of YA, but don't want to read adult books. And so now we're having this issue where we're being exposed to books that are supposed to be for this audience, that are written for an older audience, and so it's creating gaps in books for the appropriate age groups, especially that 12 to 14 age group. They are very, very difficult to recommend books for because there's not a lot on the market, not as much as there's been in the past. But yeah, y'all, those are things to me that make a book bad. And if a book has like one of these elements, it doesn't mean that it's automatically a 2-star read for me, but when I start to see some of these elements, it automatically detracts from the book being able to be a 5-star read. It can't, I won't do it. 5 stars for me are like perfection. They're absolute perfection. And when I start getting into these things or seeing these elements, I don't feel inclined to give a book a 5-star review. Now, when I start to see a plethora of these things, or an egregious amount of this existing in a book, then that's when we start shifting into, okay, it's a solid book, to, okay, this book is not good at all. One of the thrillers I read, The Night of the Storm, that one had unlikable characters because it was lack of character development. Pacing was out of control with the plot. It was too obvious. Those elements immediately dropped it down to 2 stars, which made it go from being maybe an okay book to a book that I don't know I would openly recommend anyone to read. But let me know in the comments down below, like, what are some elements that make a book not great for you? And as always, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more content from me, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell for notifications. And if you're looking for ways to follow me on social media or support the channel, all the links will be down in the description box below, and I will be back with another video soon. 'Cause I ain't even there. It's in the